He's alongside David Spears for tonight's People's Forum. David, over to you.
Kieran, thank you very much. Good evening to those watching at home and to those here at the Geelong RSL. Welcome to the first People's Forum of election year 2013, and please make welcome Opposition Leader Tony Abbott. Now, on behalf of Sky News, the Herald Sun and the Geelong Advertiser, it's great to have you all here tonight for this forum, and we're in, of course, the most marginal electorate in the country, Corangamite. It's held by Labor at the moment on a wafer-thin margin, and this region, for those watching at home, is home to, well, it's a manufacturing heartland. The Ford plant, the Shell refinery, Alcoa, all based in this region, big employers, but all facing pressure at the moment, particularly from the high Australian dollar, and no doubt we'll hear a bit about those pressures this evening. The rules tonight are straightforward. This audience has been chosen by Galaxy Research. They'll ask the questions. Tony Abbott will give the answers, hopefully. We don't know. Tony Abbott doesn't know what those questions will be. We'll try and get through as many as we can. Before we get to the first question, I'll ask the opposition leader to make a few opening remarks.
Well, David, thank you very much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you. This is not my night. This is your night. I want to give you, though, at the outset, a message of hope and optimism. I am utterly convinced that our best days are ahead of us. I believe in the marrow of my bones, as I'm sure you do, that we are a great country and a great people. I think, and I hope to persuade you, that we are a great country and a great people currently let down by a bad government. It's very hard to have confidence in our country if you can't have confidence in the government. Let me give you just a few figures, if I may. Economic growth per head has been just over 0.5% under this government. Under the Howard government, it was almost 2.5% a year. We are currently saving at the rate of some 10% of our income. Why? Because we don't trust the government to save. And if people aren't spending, if people aren't investing and employing, it's very hard to have confidence in our country. Multi-factor productivity has actually gone down by 3% over the last 5 years. So my challenge starts with reviving the strongest economy that we can possibly be. That's why I want to get rid of the carbon tax. That's why I want to reduce red tape and green tape. That's why I want to move workplace relations back to the sensible centre, because that will unleash the creativity of our people and give us back the confidence that we need if we are to achieve all the great things that we are capable of as Australians. As I said, this is your night, not mine. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks to Sky News, meetings like this were a significant part of the last election campaign, but I've got to say I feel very comfortable in meetings like this because I've been doing them in my own electorate for the best part of 20 years. So thanks very much for coming. I look forward to the dialogue. I think that the quality of our government, the quality of our polity is immensely improved if the Australian people have the chance that you have, that we have tonight, to discuss the great issues facing our country.
Tony Abbott, thank you very much for that. Let's get straight into the questions. Just a simple rule, if you can tell us your first name and if you're comfortable what you do for a bit of context, and then hit us with the question. So,
good evening, Mr. Abbott. My name's John. I'm from Mount Duneed. I'm a farmer. I've got a question regarding the Medibank system. Is it the intention of your government to sell off Medibank to fund some election promises further down the track as a full privatisation model? Could you please explain your position on that?
Sure. Well, John, I'm a great believer in a strong public health system and a strong private health system too. As many of you might remember, I was the health minister for 4 years in the Howard government. And in that time, when I was the minister, private health insurance rates achieved new records, but also bulk billing rates achieved new records. So we were able to do the right thing by both private health and public health. And I know here in the Geelong area, thanks to GMHBA, a lot of people are privately insured, and I think it's important that we put incentives in place to ensure that private health insurance coverage is maximised. Now, you've specifically asked me about Medibank. If you've got a strong competitive market, I don't think there's any need to have one of the private health insurers in government ownership. Just as we no longer need to have the Commonwealth Bank in government ownership because we have a strong competitive banking system, I think that the best guarantee of the lowest possible premiums is a strong comparative market, not keeping one of the insurers in government ownership.
Don't you see Medibank as more of a regulation model for other insurers, though?
Well, I put this question to you, John. Is Medibank private the best and lowest premiums here in Geelong? And I suspect the answer is no, it's not.
Has been
I
for me.
suspect GMHBA would probably be the best one. So that's my thought.
Well, a plug there for GMHBA. But,
Thanks for the $50.
I think there was a commitment there that you will continue with the plan to privatise.
Yeah, no,
Medibank
that's right.
private.
That's
okay,
right.
let's get our next question.
How do you do? My name's Graham. I'm from East Geelong. I'm a Beeline employee. My question concerns the carbon tax. What guarantee can you give us that you will abolish the carbon tax completely and not just rehash it and serve it back to us under another guise later down the track?
Well, Graham, I don't want to repeat the mistake that the current Prime Minister has made of saying one thing before an election and doing the opposite after an election. If there's one thing which has damaged, I think fatally damaged, this government and this Prime Minister, it was her promise before the last election there will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. She made that promise to win votes, and then shortly after the election, in order to hold office, she did the deal with the Greens to give us a carbon tax. Now, the lesson of this government is that the next government must keep its commitments. So we will get rid of the carbon tax, lock, stock and barrel. It absolutely goes. Some people say, oh, but what about if the Greens and the Labor Party try to frustrate your mandate in the Senate? Well, I don't believe that the Labor Party will persist in supporting a carbon tax if it loses an election which is a referendum on the carbon tax. But as many of you would know, there are provisions under the Constitution for resolving a deadlock between the House and the Senate, and should our mandate be frustrated in the Senate, we will make use of those provisions.
Okay, thank
Thanks,
you.
Graham.
Can I just ask how long would that take to get rid of the carbon tax?
Look, I am absolutely confident that by the middle of 2014 it will be gone.
Okay.
Absolutely and utterly gone.
Let's get our next question.
Hi, my name's Lachlan and I'm a Deakin student here in Geelong. Mr. Abbott, my question tonight is on an issue that affects Australians across the country, including here in Geelong, and it has two parts, so I'll ask you to stay with me. While marriage equality amendments have passed across the ditch last night, are looking set to pass in France within the next week, and before the year's out in the UK under a Conservative government, do you believe now that marriage equality is inevitable in Australia? Or are you of the opinion that politicians in Canberra know better than the 65% of Australians who have consistently shown that they support principles of equality, freedom and fairness on this issue? The second part...
I'm prepared to deal with that question
Sure.
now, and then
Yep.
you can ask the second
Sure.
question, okay? Look, I think this is one of those issues on which decent, reasonable people of goodwill can differ. Obviously, you have a particular view on this, and I respectfully have a different view. And I accept that if you go by opinion polls, your view is probably more prevalent than mine. On the other hand, Julia Gillard, Kim Beazley, John Howard and Kevin Rudd also have the view that I've got on this, which is, if you like, the orthodox standard position. We did consider this in the National Parliament a few months ago, and the result was pretty decisively against any change to the Marriage Act. Let's see if future parliaments decide differently, but in the end it is up to future parliaments to make that decision one way or another. Now, is gay marriage inevitable? Well, look, if you go back a decade or so, people thought that a republic was inevitable, and yet I don't believe it is inevitable, certainly not anytime soon. So I'm reluctant to say that any particular change that depends upon our decision is inevitable.
Sure.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, sure. So the second part of my question is this. As to whether or not you would oppose a move from within the broader Liberal Party to change the party's position on allowing for a conscience vote on the issue, because considering, of course, the long tradition that the Liberal Party does have with conscience votes and allowing members to freely vote. And I know in the past this question's been asked and you've referred to the fact that party members aren't locked in, but generally the caucus does vote with the party line, don't they, at the very least? So.
Okay, look, a little bit of history, if I may.
Sure.
The Marriage Act was amended back in, I think it was 2001, to explicitly provide that marriage was between a man and a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, that had been taken for granted, and it wasn't felt necessary to explicitly provide that way in the Act, but it was amended back in 2001 with the explicit support of the then Howard government and the then Beazley-led opposition. So this was actual policy. It wasn't a conscience vote back then, it was a whipped vote on both sides of the parliament to support that explicit change to the Marriage Act. Now, going into the last election, it was the Labor Party's policy and the Coalition's policy that marriage was between a man and a woman. Subsequent to the election, the Labor Party changed its position. We had quite a long discussion about this in the shadow cabinet and then again in the party room, and the view that I think was fairly decisive for us was you shouldn't say one thing before an election and do a different thing afterwards. So we couldn't in conscience go to the election saying that this was our position and we weren't going to change it and then change it after an election. Now, if something is your party policy, you don't get a conscience vote on it or a free vote on it. What I've said, and happy to repeat again, is that what our policy is post the election will be a matter for the Coalition party room at that time.
Right, because the reason I'm asking this question now, though, is because you've said that coming out of the last election, that was the party policy, but we're heading into a new election now.
And this
would make sense to be the option.
And going into the new election, I'm saying that whether that remains our policy after the election will be a matter for the incoming Coalition party room.
All right, we're going to have to move on and get some more questions. Thanks so much for that. Let's hear our next question.
Good evening, Mr. Abbott. My name is Joan. I'm a retired teacher. I'm a tutor for a discussion group for University of the Third Age. And when we met last, and I knew I was coming on this program, on behalf of the group, I'd like to ask you this question. If you are elected Prime Minister, what will be your top priority?
Right. Well, thank you, Joan. And good on you for your work with the University of the Third Age. Since my dad has retired, he spends a bit of time with the University of the Third Age, and it keeps him young, interested and interesting, and that's very important. Look, the number one priority is to get our budgetary house in order, because in the end, governments, like households and businesses, have got to live within their means, and you can't live beyond your means for any length of time without getting yourself into terrible trouble. The Howard government understood that. I don't believe the current government really does. We had promise after promise from the Prime Minister. You might remember this, we will not fail, David. The Prime Minister said just a few days...
it was at one of these forums, in fact.
Yeah, exactly right. We will not fail to deliver a surplus this year, but they're not going to. They still haven't told us what the deficit's going to be, but obviously it's going to be substantial. So you had the Howard government that in its last 4 budgets gave us the 4 biggest surpluses in Australian history. You've got the current government, which in its first 4 budgets has given us the 4 biggest deficits in Australian history. So that is our first priority. Now, it's not the only priority. Obviously, repealing the carbon tax will be the first thing we begin, should we win. Restoring proper border protection policies is a very important business that will begin on day one as well. Try to ensure that government is as efficient and effective as possible is going to be a very important priority. Revitalising work for the dole. Try to ensure that communities like Geelong don't get job shocks week in, week out. Very important. But overall, we've got to get our economic house in order, and that means getting the government's finances under control.
So when will you have a surplus?
Well, we don't know what the starting point is, David. That's the difficulty. We were confident that we could deliver a surplus based on what the government was telling us until just before Christmas, but all bets are off given that the government won't tell us what the deficit will be. We are confident that we will at all times deliver more prudent and responsible financial management than the current government because it's in our DNA to deliver surpluses and pay back debt. Just look at what the Howard government did.
Joan, thanks for that question. Let's get our next question.
Good evening, Mr. Abbott. My name is John. I'd like to ask you about 457 visas. Does the coalition government intend to abolish the use of 457 visas or at least cap them?
John, the short answer is no and no. And the reason why is because if they're being implemented properly, they don't damage Australian jobs and hurt Australian workers. They help Australian jobs and they help Australian workers because they are there to keep businesses growing and expanding when you can't find an Australian worker with the relevant skills. Now, I accept that occasionally you might get a dodgy business that is misusing the system. I accept that. And where that's happening, it should be dealt with and dealt with severely. But overall, if we want our businesses to flourish and employ, and if we want people to be investing and employing, and skills are in short supply and workers are hard to get, we need the option of bringing people in on this basis. And I've got to say that people who come to this country and work and pay taxes from day one, if they choose to stay at the end of the 4 years, they make the best possible migrants. And I think we should be welcoming people who can make a contribution to our country, not discouraging them.
Yeah, and the other part about it though is, do you intend to do anything about these people that misuse these 457 visas, these companies that do? Naturally, there's a lot of fear with workers in Australia, and there is a lot of information going around where people have been going for jobs, and some in Western Australia and some here, where they've gone and they've said, have you got a 457 visa? If you haven't, don't apply.
Okay, look, John, I know there are anecdotes like that, and I would urge people who believe that they have been the victims of that kind of treatment to come and talk to their local Member of Parliament. And I know anyone in Geelong who feels they've got the rough end of the pineapple in that way, please talk to Sarah Henderson, our candidate, who's in the room somewhere, and I'm sure would make herself known to you.
Well, John, let me just ask you, without naming businesses, have you seen this yourself?
Not personally myself. It's only what I do know of certain people have told me, and what I've heard on the radio and etc.
Yeah, no, and look, John, I would encourage anyone who believes that he or she has hard evidence of this to take it to their local Member of Parliament or, as I said, local candidate, if that's what you'd prefer. But can I just say this? People who come in on 457 visas cost more than an Australian to employ, because you've A, got to pay them a market wage, and you've B, got to bring them here and invariably house them here. So the costs are higher than they would be for a local person. So if there is evidence that the system is being abused, please, let's have it and we'll tackle it. We really will. But if it works as it's supposed to work, it is actually a benefit for Australian workers, not a problem for Australian workers. And until very recently, members of the current government would boast about the contribution that subclass 457 visas were making to our economy.
John, thanks very much for that question.
You.
Let's thank you. Let's move on to the next one.
Mr. Abbott, my name's Mel. I'm a registered nurse. You've stated that if you're elected, you will scrap the low-income superannuation contribution tax, thereby affecting about 3.6 million Australian low-income earners, 2.1 million of whom are women, and make up a vast majority of my profession.
Sure.
Most of those, or a lot of those women, do work part-time, they raise families, and they're contributing to their future and their family's future and to their retirement income. Can you tell me why you would choose to hurt 3.6 million Australian workers, many of whom are the women working part-time and raising families, with a $4 billion tax increase aimed directly at them? And do you not recognise the long-term benefits of closing the superannuation gender gap and the incentives encouraging people to build their retirement savings however they're funded?
Okay, Mel, thanks for that question, but can we have a little bit of a reality check on this one? And the truth is that the current government has already hurt people in that position big time by cutting the Howard government's superannuation low-income contribution from $1,500 a year to $500 a year. So the current government doesn't come to this particular argument with clean hands. That's the first point I make. The second point I make is that this particular measure, the offset that you talk about, is funded by the mining tax. The mining tax is not raising any revenue. So I think we have to be fairly suspicious that if this government gets re-elected, it will be gone, because this government has form when it comes to fiddling with people's superannuation. And as just about everyone in this room would know, this government was threatening big time to raid the superannuation piggy bank until just a week or so back. Why do we know that's the case? Because Simon Crean told us, and Simon Crean was part of the Expenditure Review Committee. So I accept that many people in this room may not like what we are proposing to do in this respect, but nevertheless we've got to be frugal and prudent and responsible, and if the tax that's funding the measure is not raising any money, I don't believe it's responsible to keep the measure.
And I don't think it's responsible to be frugal and hurt the lowest income earners in the country.
Fair point, Mel. Very fair point. Very fair point. And can I ask you, Mel, what did you say to the current government when they drastically reduced the Howard government measure that was helping the lowest income superannuation earners?
I expressed my feelings at the ballot box.
Mel, thank you. Can I just follow up on that and say, what if the mining tax does raise a bit more money? Is this something you'd revisit, the low-income super thing? Well,
in fact, we're going to abolish the mining tax, and we've said that from the word go. We've said that from the word go. Look, if I can just add a little, and obviously from the response to Mel's question, there is considerable support for his position in this room. And I have to warn you in all candour that an incoming coalition government will do some things that aren't popular. We will do some things that aren't popular. We will do some things that will hurt, because when a country, a government has been living beyond its means, you've got to take remedial action, and you can't reduce expenditure, reduce the growth of expenditure without looking at some of the existing expenditure measures. So if we're going to do our job properly, we've got to get the budget under control, and inevitably that is going to involve some tough things. But again, if I may say this to you, Mal, we're going to be upfront about it. We are upfront before an election about this particular measure, upfront before an election. But what did Kevin Rudd say before the 07 election? Not one jot, not one tittle of superannuation would be changed. And then there were changes after change, including reducing the low-income superannuation co-contribution. So, look, mark us down if you like for what we are proposing to do, but please mark us up for having the honesty to tell people before an election.
But just one more on super. The government's most recent change is affecting the 16,000 wealthiest Australians. Isn't that a responsible thing to do?
Well, again, it is a breach of commitments made. And in principle, if you invest your money on conditions that the government says are settled, you shouldn't have that changed afterwards. Now, money that's put into superannuation is not the government's money. It's your money. It's our money. And it shouldn't be treated as a piggy bank to be raided by the government whenever it's short. This is precisely the kind of thing which gives government a bad name. This is precisely the kind of thing that erodes trust and confidence in government, and that's the last thing I want to do. I want to rebuild confidence in government after 5 years that haven't always been very good for that.
Okay, let's get to our next question.
Yes, Mr Abbott. My name's Rod. I'm a retiree. You just mentioned confidence in government. I have a problem with confidence in government and opposition as well when I sit and watch the Parliament on TV and the way you guys carry on like kindergarten kids. Now, if you got into the Prime Ministership, would you do something to clean that up a little bit and you know, try and make it a little bit more sensible? Because I find it hard to think that I've got 3 kids and 6, 7 grandchildren, and I sit there thinking these bozos are, you know, forming their future. And, you know, the poor old speaker says order, 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 and nobody does anything. If they're school teachers, they'd send them to the headmaster.
Or in the case of the Speaker, they'll send us out for bad behaviour.
Or you'll run out so you don't have to vote.
Rod, look, it's a very good observation you've made, and I can well understand why people who choose to watch our Parliament may well be dismayed by what they see. Now, I'm not pretending for a moment that my own parliamentary behaviour has been absolutely without blemish, and I'm not pretending for a second that there weren't some pretty torrid scenes in the Parliament under the former Howard government. But I would ask people to consider how Parliament was conducted between 1996 and 2007 and how it's been conducted subsequently, and allow that to help influence their judgment about the quality of different people and the quality of particular governments. Peter Costello gave some pretty robust answers when he was the Treasurer. When I was the Leader of the House of Representatives, I gave some pretty robust answers. But Prime Minister Howard, I don't believe, in the Parliament was anything like as nakedly partisan as either Prime Minister Rudd or particularly Prime Minister Gillard have been.
But he had you guys to do his dirty work.
And, well, you know, the mark of a good Prime Minister is this innate understanding that you have obligations to everyone, even people who didn't vote for you. This innate understanding that we're all Australians when it's said and done, regardless of which political party is our normal preference. Now, Bob Hawke got that. John Howard got that. That's why Bob Hawke was arguably the best ever Labor Prime Minister, and John Howard was certainly the best coalition Prime Minister since Bob Menzies, because they realised that they had to govern for everyone. The problem with the current incumbent is that I don't think she understands that, and I think she's often seemed more like an alternative opposition leader than a Prime Minister. And if you think I'm being a little harsh, again, what did Simon Crean say to us just the other day? He said that the problem with the current government, the reason why he resigned, was because he didn't like the class war approach, and he thought the Prime Minister herself had what he called a tin ear. I'll try to avoid that, Rod. I can't promise that I won't occasionally let myself and let the country down, because we're all human. But I have learnt from watching good Prime Ministers and not so good Prime Ministers, and I want to model myself on the better ones.
Yeah, did you answer my question?
Well, I tried. I tried. Let the audience be the judge.
Would you make an effort to try and, well, let's make Parliament a bit more dignified and a bit more respectful, so that that can pass on, because things start at the top, and you want to be at the top. And we see a lot of disrespect in the streets and everything today.
Yeah.
And I really think, when I'm watching these clowns performing, that what hope have the young kids got when the leaders of the country do that?
Well,
and,
Rod,
abuse each other and carry on the way you do.
Okay, fair point. I will do my best, and you'll be the judge.
Rod, thanks very much for that. Let's good question. Let's get the next one.
Mr. Abbott, my name's Chris. I'm an account manager. I'm based in Geelong. I guess I actually originally had one question, but I guess this first one's actually a bit of a personal question. Now, recently my mother was diagnosed with terminal illness. You know, so far so good. I guess the thing for me, but recently she'd gone and applied to get a pension for a carer's pension and an age pension. We were assessed, knocked back based on things as assets, which the fact is assets are actually intangible assets, although considerable, yet intangible. Yet it bothered me hearing today that you've got people who have come to this country illegally, people who aren't even Australian citizens, and yet they're actually getting on bridging visas, yet they're able to get pensions, they're able to get payments, yet people who've lived in this country all their lives, have paid their taxes, are actual citizens, are entitled to nothing. And that to me is, it's disgusting. I think it's almost betrayal of, Australian citizenship. It's a betrayal of the people. It's a government, policy not actually for the people. The question is, what's your response to something like that?
Well, Chris, I think a lot of people feel aggrieved by the flow of illegal boat arrivals because they see them costing our country, costing taxpayers a lot of money, and they know that there are a lot of people who are Australians, either migrant Australians or native-born Australians, who are doing it tough. And when people who came the right way are doing it tough, there is understandable resentment about people who have come the wrong way. Now, the only way to fundamentally deal with this is to stop the flow of boats. John Howard did. The current government, I'm afraid, has restarted it all by changing policies in ways it shouldn't have. I don't say for a second it's going to be easy to stop the boats again, because the situation is far, far worse now than it was. I think there was about 5,000 illegal boat arrivals in the worst year of the Howard government. Boats are arriving at about 3 times that rate at the moment. So things are bad, and they're getting worse under this government.
The thing is, sorry, just interrupt, the things, and this is sort of a secondary to that question as well, as the fact is that wouldn't your government's policies be to discourage the people from coming, and that is either by much harsher border control policies or by simply not allowing, actually making it very clear there will be no welfare to anyone who has come to this country illegally, no matter if they've passed assessment, no matter what, they are entitled to nothing? Wouldn't that make more sense, at least give no incentive for people to come here in the first place?
Well, just a couple of observations. We can't fail to treat with a certain humanity people who turn up here, even if they've done the wrong thing by getting here. So we do have an obligation as human beings to ensure that people are not in distress, to ensure that the basic necessities of life are in some appropriate way provided. And that obligation extends even to boat people. But what we've got to do is put policies in place that discourage the flow and stop it. So what we're going to do, emulating in large measure the Howard government, is first of all, they will go to Nauru or Manus Island if they turn up, because that's a deterrent. They will only get temporary protection visas if they turn up and are found to be refugees, because that denies the people smugglers a product to sell. If they get permanent residency, once they're here and found to be refugees, well, that's the big prize. They've got the big prize, which is why people will pay $10,000 to get on a boat and risk their lives. We've got to have the option of turning boats around. It was done by the Howard government, not often, but enough to let the people smugglers and their customers know. And back in 2002 when it was happening, Julia Gillard, then the Shadow Minister of Immigration, said it was a good thing and she thought it was an important part of deterrence. And we've got to have a better relationship with Indonesia, because the vast majority of people who come illegally by boat transit through Indonesia, and if we can interdict that, it'll be a lot easier to stop the boats.
I guess there's another important question, because we've sort of gotten off the original question I wanted.
Just last one.
Yep. All right. My concern is obviously the future of this country, manufacturing. It's a big issue now. A lot of my client base, is manufacturing that now. One of the things I've noticed is, I'm looking at the government spending, 130 billion plus towards the welfare system, only 20 billion towards defence. Yet, has your government considered the possibility of possibly cutting welfare spending considerably and redirecting that funds into areas of the economy such as research and development, technology, innovation, infrastructure spending, things that will actually create new jobs, new industries for this country, and in fact new employment, which would effectively help take the population's reliance off the socialist means ideas of welfare? What's your thoughts? Would you be prepared to have the guts to do something like that?
Well, Chris, I agree with Tony Blair, a well-known British Labor Prime Minister, that the best form of welfare is work. I absolutely agree with that, but I also accept that for various reasons people can't always work. Now, if you're a working age person and you're capable of working, you must work, preferably for a wage, but if not, for the dole. When I was the Employment Minister, I was in charge of work for the dole. It massively expanded when I was the Employment Minister, and I think it was a very important part of getting the message across to people that there was an expectation that everyone will join the team, that everyone will pull his or her weight as far as is humanly possible. Having said that, if you genuinely can't work, a decent and humane society has got to make provision for you. And it's always a question of getting the balance right, and I'm confident that a coalition government, again looking at the Howard government's record, that a coalition government is more likely to get the balance right than the current incumbents.
All right, thank you for that.
Thanks, Chris. Can I just clarify something you said back on the asylum seeker issue, that there should be a degree of humanity for asylum seekers, even if they've done the wrong thing in the way they get here? A lot of asylum seekers are found to be refugees. Have they done the wrong thing in the way they've come?
Well, the short answer is yes. You should not come to Australia without a visa in a way that you must know is not right, and you certainly should not destroy your documents on the voyage to Australia, which is what I gather the vast majority of people arriving by boat do. And on the vexed question of are we entitled to call them illegal arrivals by boat, Article 31 of the UN Convention specifically refers to people who arrive illegally.
Okay. And will you see within months a stopping or slowing of the boats?
We'll make a difference from day one. We will make a difference from day one, and I am confident that we can make a very substantial difference, within the life of an incoming first-term government.
3 years.
We will make a difference from day one. Will it be a week? Will it be a month? Will it be a year? We will do the best we can as quickly as we can, and we will be judged on this, as we should.
Okay, let's get our next question.
Good evening, my name's Kelly. I work in superannuation and I'm also an SES volunteer.
Excellent.
My question is
I'm
in relation.
what you'd call a CFA volunteer, Kelly. Only we call it the RFS in New South Wales.
My question is in relation to emergency services and its funding, pretty much. So, SES obviously relies heavily on community donations, fundraising, as does the CFA and all that sort of thing. And we get minimal funding from federal and state governments per unit, and we have to pay for our own unit to run it and everything, petrol costs, uniforms, all that sort of thing. Over the years, the funding has decreased considerably per unit. And so obviously we need to fundraise more money, and it is difficult. SES is on the bottom of the chain, police, paramedics, CFA. Basically, my question is, what is your government prepared to do towards funding for emergency services, and in particular SES? What are you prepared to commit to?
Well, Kelly, I'm going to disappoint you because while I am myself a Rural Fire Service volunteer in New South Wales and was a deputy captain in the Davidson Brigade for a couple of years before I became the opposition leader, and I'm still doing my duty crews, not as often as I was, but I'm still an efficient firefighter, and I'm honoured to be part of the brigade. By the same token, one of the things that we cherish is our volunteer status, and one of the things we accept is that we do have to do a certain amount of fundraising. That's just part of being a member of the Rural Fire Service, which is our New South Wales equivalent of the CFA. Now, in New South Wales, RFS funding is almost entirely a matter for state and local governments. I assume that's the case in Victoria as well. I don't know what the state and local governments have been doing here in Victoria for the SES and the CFA, and if they've cut funding, I'm disappointed, and I hope they restore it. But it's never been the federal government's job to directly fund the RFS, the CFA or the state SESs. Sometimes in periods of national disaster, the federal government will reimburse the state, and the state will make good expenses that the SES and others have incurred. Under John Howard, the federal government stepped in as a result of the Sydney fire emergency at the end of 2001 to fund the Elvis air cranes, but to the best of my knowledge, that is the limit of the Commonwealth's funding for the volunteer emergency services. Now, I regret any funding cut, but I do, if I may say so, Kelly, think that this is probably a matter for the state government.
Thanks.
Kelly, thank you. Let's get our next question.
Hello, my name's Linda and I'm a registered nurse. My question relates to global warming and the environment and our long-term future in relation to this. Now, as we know, the Labor Party has the carbon tax, which obviously, if the coalition government wins the election, you will repeal. So my question relates to, can you explain your policy or policies on global warming and the environment, and to how this would be better than the current carbon tax in relation to global warming and the environment? And also, with all due respect, if you could concentrate on your policies rather than how bad the carbon tax is, I'd really appreciate that.
Well, what about if I start with my policies?
All right.
And then I might say something about the environmental as opposed to the economic impact of the carbon tax.
That would be good.
Okay, now our policy, which Greg Hunt and I released back in February of 2010, is called direct action. We think that the best way to tackle emissions is to directly reduce emissions rather than indirectly reduce them through taxing economic activity. We also think that the best way to reduce emissions is through positive incentives rather than through financial penalties. So we're going to set up this emissions reduction fund, and we're going to ask people to come to us with proposals to reduce emissions, and we will fund those proposals on the basis of what we think are the most cost-effective options. And so we will fund tree planting, we will fund soil carbon, which is getting better soils through organic rather than chemical fertilisers and so on. We will fund smarter technology and improved practices. For instance, Lindsay Fox, a great Victorian, tells me that Linfox has reduced its emissions by about 35% through better driver education and through better driving practices. Now, that's a very low-cost way of reducing emissions, but a very effective way of reducing emissions. So that's what we're going to be looking at, putting money aside, about $1 billion a year from savings in the budget to fund these kind of positive incentives. Now, we're confident on the basis of assurances we've had from people in the sector that we can get our emissions down by 5% a year by 2020 using this mechanism. Now, very briefly, I'll turn to the government. Now, if you look at the government's official documents, the official modelling documents released by the government on Carbon Sunday back in July of 2011, under the carbon tax, our emissions will actually increase by 2020. They go up from 578 million tonnes a year now to 621 million tonnes a year in 2020, despite a carbon tax estimated to be about $37 a tonne by then. Now, we only get the 5% reduction by buying carbon credits from abroad. In 2020, under the government's own modelling, we're supposed to be spending $3.5 billion buying carbon credits from abroad. So my problem with the government's policy, it's not with their intention. We all want to try to reduce emissions. We all want to do that. We all want to protect the environment. We all want to hand to our kids an environment in at least as good shape as we've received it ourselves. But the carbon tax isn't going to work. Even on the government's own figures, our emissions go up, not down.
Thank you.
There you go. Linda, thank you very much. Let's get our next question.
I'm Mr. Abbott. I'm Michael. I'm a tennis coach. Mine is on the 2 points of the fuel pricing in Australia. One, the high price of our fuel. We're set to be fairly self-sufficient on our oil in Australia. But 2 years ago, we were told by the ACCC that our price of our dollar was so low, so it was costing us so much. Now our dollar is at its highest point for a long, long time, forever. And then the ACCC come and say that now it's because of this Singapore price. And then another time they'll come out and they'll go and say it's the price of the oil. This fluctuation, we are very, very high compared to the likes of America on our price of our fuel. The other one is the fluctuation of the fuel. You go and you see the Today Show or whatever, they go, I'll go and fill up 10 days around, 12 days around, 14 days around. I don't know why we should have to, as every Australian has to go and guess when we've got to go and fill up our fuel. Why cannot there not be a stagnant price in that fuel instead of the wife telling me, why didn't I fill up yesterday?
Doesn't matter what happens, I think you'll be told that you could have done things differently. I think that's been most of our experiences. But look, the price of petrol and its variations does annoy a lot of people, no doubt about that. And the current government said before the last election that they'd bring in something called Fuel Watch. And Fuel Watch was supposed to fix this. Well, they brought it in, it didn't work, and they scrapped it. Now, the difficulty is that we don't actually produce most of our own oil anymore. Most of it's imported. Regrettably, despite our big reserves of coal and gas, it seems that we don't have that much oil, and so we will continue, I suspect, to import our oil, and therefore we are going to be paying what we call import parity pricing. That's to say the world price. As for the variability, well, look, no one has yet demonstrated, notwithstanding Fuel Watch, notwithstanding the ACCC and others, that this isn't a genuine competitive market. Now, it's a competitive market that frustrates the hell out of people, but I'm not sure that there is any additional regulation which isn't going to make a bad situation worse. That's my
just this competitive thing. If you see one service station will change, the next one up the road change, the next one. Why wouldn't one be able to go and say, well, I'll keep my price down? It just, that to me doesn't make a competitive. But they all change.
Okay, but I suspect if we were to bring in further regulation, it wouldn't mean that everyone charged the lowest price. I think it would be more likely to mean that everyone charged a higher price. I think that's the way regulation invariably works.
Thanks, Mike. Just it is an issue for this area as well with Shell trying to sell the refinery. Do you think fuel should continue to be refined in Australia or imported?
Well, I'd like fuel to be refined in Australia, but at the moment we're making it harder and harder to do. And while Shell did not nominate the carbon tax as the principal cause of their difficulties, certainly it does add to the cost pressures here in this country which make things like that uneconomic.
Let's get our next question.
Good evening. Welcome, Mr Abbott, to the most marginal electorate in the country. My name's Carl Morris. I'm a small business proprietor building websites and social media for small businesses. We've got 5 full-time staff, 5 full-time staff and 4 permanent part-time staff. Work choices is dead, and I respect that, but as a small business owner, the pendulum has swung way too far in the opposite direction now from our perception and in reality. If there is no work choices, and I hope there is something better than fair work, because fair work is certainly not fair on small business. And I just find that I tend to think that the Liberal Party, in my perspective, tends to run and cover every time the word work choices is mentioned, and I'm happy with that, but surely something's got to be done to bring this pendulum back into alignment rather than swinging out to the left the way it is at the moment.
Look, Carl, thank you for that. I think there would be many small businesses who would feel your sentiments, who would feel that the system has been rigged against them. Now, there will be change under the coalition. It will be careful, cautious, responsible change that is designed to address the flexibility, the militancy, and above all else the productivity problems that are now emerging under the Fair Work Act. But we will work within the framework of the existing Act, and we'll have a lot more to say on this in the relatively near future. The last thing I want to do is to see people leaving small business because they don't feel they're getting a fair go. In the end, if you haven't got an employer, you won't have employees, you won't have workers. And one of the things that we understand in the marrow of our bones as a coalition, but which I don't think the current government always does, is that if the business is not making a profit, it's not going to survive, and if it doesn't survive, the workers all go. So we understand that. On the other hand, we also know that the worker's got to get a fair go. The worker deserves justice, just as the manager and the owner deserves justice, and it's a question of getting the balance right. Now, we got the balance wrong in our last term. I think the current government has got the balance wrong, and we do need to take it back to the sensible centre, and there will be more that we'll say between now and polling day that I think will give you a level of comfort, but will also reassure the workers of Australia that their pay and conditions are safe under the coalition.
Carl, we often talk about IR in a policy sense, but I'm just wondering, you're a small business owner, give us a practical example of what you want Tony Abbott to do.
A classic example is under the current Fair Work, sick leave and accumulates for an employee. If I've got an employee that's been with me for 5 years and they go off on carers leave, they are entitled to 10 days per year. They get 50 days full paid leave. As a small business, it would cripple me.
Can you do anything about that?
Well, my instinct, and it's a long time since I was the Workplace Relations Minister, but my instinct is that that's mostly been the case. It may not necessarily have been the case under Australian workplace agreements, but under awards, I suspect you would find that that has always been the case. Now, obviously, if your workers don't treat you with respect, if your workers aren't reasonable, it puts the business in a very difficult position. And this is where we've got to understand that the workplace is not a them and us situation. It shouldn't be a them and us situation. It ought to be a situation where we all understand that in order to get a bit, you've got to give a bit. And if you think it's all about taking and not about giving, everyone will be worse off.
But if that doesn't happen, will you stop sick leave being accumulated?
Well, the short answer is I don't believe that that has ever been contemplated under awards, and we have no plans to make those sorts of changes.
Okay. Carl, thanks for the example you've given. Let's get our next question.
Hello, my name's Lil Bowden. I'm self-employed in the Direct Selling Association and the auntie of a 15-year-old boy with a mental disability and autism. And my question is in reference to the NDIS, which I believe is now being called disability care. And nobody knows when disability will strike in their family, whether through birth or an accident. If the accident happens on the road, at least you have the TAC to assist you with your ongoing costs and services. But if your child is born with autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, you're committed to a lifetime of care and most definitely financial and emotional ruin and social isolation. No one's at fault. And what I'd like to ask is, what commitment does your party have towards the full introduction of the NDIS or the disability care program?
Mm-hmm. Good question, and I think I can give you a good answer. And I have become more familiar than ever with the role of carers and the whole issue of disabilities in our community because last year and again this year, the polypedal annual bike ride that I've been doing for the last 16 years is going to have Carers Australia as its beneficiary. And last year when we pedalled from Geelong through to Canberra, at every place we stopped, Carers Australia had organised carers and the people they're caring for to come and meet with us. So it was a real eye-opener to the world that carers and people with disabilities have got to wrestle with. So I have become not just theoretically passionate about the National Disability Insurance Scheme, but I have become an absolute believer in this, in part because of the work that I've done recently with Carers Australia. Now, we are totally committed to it. When the government announced the Productivity Commission review, we supported it. When the Productivity Commission reported, we supported that. When the government announced that it was taking steps down the path, we supported them. Every step of the way, the opposition has supported the government. The government likes to talk about the alleged negativity of the opposition. Well, on this one, I have been Dr. Yes every step of the way. What I promised, or what I asked the government to consider as a way of making sure that this really happened, was the establishment of a bipartisan committee of the Parliament, co-chaired by both sides' disability shadow minister and minister, to ensure that the NDIS project was kept on track over the life of 3 terms of Parliament with the 9 different governments that are going to have to be involved. Now, if we win the election, I will go ahead and establish that committee, and it will be staffed by, it will be comprised of members of Parliament who've got a real stake in this, a real interest in this, because I believe this is an important change, a very important change. It will be a sign of our humanity as a country that we are prepared to make this change. And when it happens, the NDIS will belong to everyone.
Great.
It won't belong to the Labor Party, it won't belong to the Liberal Party. It will be the product of a decent nation, and that's what I want to see happen.
Thank you very much.
Lil, thank you. We are nearly out of time. We're going to take our final question now. I know there's many more who wanted to get questions in, but let's get the last one.
Hi, Tony. My name's Damien, and I work for GMHBA. And my job's becoming pretty tough, actually, because of the federal government rebate and the changes that the government's made. Recently, they have changed or added means testing to the federal government rebate, and soon they're looking to introduce a change to only increase the federal government rebate by the CPI index and not by the standard amount that health insurance normally increases, which is around an average of 5%. What's your stance on that?
Well, Damien, look, thanks for the question, and thanks for your work for GMHBA. Look, we invented the private health insurance rebate under the Howard government. We bitterly opposed the imposition of a means test. We bitterly opposed the changing of the indexation of the rebate. We want to restore these things as quickly as possible, but given the dire budgetary position that we are likely to inherit, we aren't putting a specific time frame on that particular change and restoration. There are a lot of things we would like to do, but we've got to accept that in a dire budgetary position, there are some really important things that can't happen tomorrow or even this year. They might have to wait 2 years, 3 years, even 4 years. The point Joe Hockey keeps making is that you cannot rectify all the damage that a bad government does overnight. We will do the best we can as quickly as we can, but we can't make specific time commitments. But I think you know, as someone who understands private health insurance, that the coalition, again in its DNA, supports private health insurance. I don't think the same can always be said for the other side.
Damien, thanks so much for that. I'm just going to squeeze in one last question, because people I spoke to around town today, an issue that hasn't really come up specifically tonight is jobs, in terms of real nervousness about unemployment here in Geelong. I know you blame the carbon tax for a lot of this, but what sort of guarantees, assurances can you give this region and Victoria more broadly about what you can do on jobs?
Well, you know, when I was the health minister, I spent a lot of time with health professionals, and those of you who are familiar with that field would know that the Hippocratic Oath starts, first, do no harm. And I reckon that's a very, very good rule for government, as well as for doctors and nurses. First, do no harm. So you don't hit people with carbon taxes. You don't impose productivity-destroying changes to the workplace. You don't rate people's superannuation. What you do try to do is get taxes responsibly down, because you've got government spending under control. You get red tape down as far as you humanly can, and you accept that the job of government is to work with people rather than to work against them, not to make changes that seriously impact on people's lives without consulting with them first. Because I know, as a minister for 9 years in a government, that the law of unintended consequences is the most important law in politics, and so many bad things get done by well-intentioned governments that haven't thought it through, and they haven't talked to people beforehand. So the best way to restore confidence is to talk to people before you make decisions, and not to gratuitously make decisions that damage them. And as for the car industry, well, look, I love my Ford Territory. It is, in my opinion, the best car ever made in Australia, and I want the motor industry to flourish in this country, but it will only flourish, yes, if government continues to provide intelligent support, but also if we can finally get exports going. And the thing that really frustrates the hell out of me with Ford is that the Territory is a bloody good product, and it's hardly available outside of this country.
But you'd have to convince Ford in the US to change the design.
And that is precisely what well, they don't have to change the design. Yes, they
make a left-hand drive.
Okay, and Ford are very good at providing left and right-hand drive versions of their world cars. Let's turn the Territory into a world car.
All right, well, it has been a very interesting hour, and hopefully it's been enlightening and helped a lot of you with making a decision in this year's election one way or another. Before